Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Today, we're going to talk about risk analysis and analytics with Safran Risk. My name is Ian Nicholson. I'm VP Solutions here at Emerald Associates. I'm a risk analysis trainer and consultant. I've been doing schedule risk analysis for many years. I started working with schedule risk analysis as the Canadian Pertmaster reseller in 2001. Joining me today is Mary Lynn Backstrom, an implementation specialist with Emerald Associates. Mary Lynn has 30 years experience working in various industries, and Mary Lynn is also an expert in both P6 and in risk analysis. So why do we conduct risk analysis? Well, there's been a number of studies that have shown that conducting risk analysis helps the project teams understand and manage the risks of the project, gets the project team discussing the challenges of the project, keeps the project team focused on the right issues. Typically the near critical paths that can come back to haunt you when we're talking about schedule, and also understand the risks to the costs of the project. Now, it is a requirement of many companies' gate approval processes, but really what we're trying to do is we're really trying to help the project team understand what's going on their project. And more recently, there's been more of a focus on combining cost and schedule risk analysis together so that we understand the dependencies between the cost and the schedule. So ask yourself, do you build detailed CPM schedules? Do you develop detailed cost estimates? Well, of course you do. Everybody does. But surprisingly, the chances of meeting your project schedule and financial goals are still typically a lot less than what we'd like them to be. So how can this be? Well, we do detailed critical path method scheduling, but there's a problem. And that problem is that the data is entered as finite values rather than ranges of uncertainties. So we'll say, okay, this task is going to take 3 people, 4 days at $100 an hour, and away we go. But the problem with that is that assumptions change over time. Assumptions like productivity factors, access to the work, just how much work there is, all those kind of things change over time. And sometimes they don't match reality. They may have at the time that the original estimate was done or the original schedule was done, but they're no longer valid when we get to building our real project. And sometimes the project just changes. The scope changes, the time changes, the conditions change. Perhaps we thought we were going to do the work in the summer and now we're doing it in the middle of winter. So we're dealing with a whole bunch of new issues in our project. Similarly, we do detailed estimating. But sometimes our estimators are too optimistic or too pessimistic. And of course, the bid process encourages aggressive estimates. Sometimes the opposite happens. Estimators add a little bit of contingency here and there, and they hide it throughout the whole cost estimate. Sometimes these estimates are built on historical experience. Sometimes they're built on just industry standards. And sometimes what happens is they just don't scale very well to match the project. Now, all of these items are what we call deterministic. And the problem with deterministic values is they don't take uncertainty or risks into account. Now, uncertainties can build on one another to make the project very different from what was originally envisioned. I mean, there's uncertainty in everything that we do. The classic example is, how long does it take you to drive to work? And for me, it's about 20 minutes, but on a bad day, it might be 35 minutes. On a good day, it might be 15 minutes. And I do this every day of my working life, but I can't tell you exactly how long it's going to take, and yet I'm going to predict it's going to take 18 months to build this multi-billion-dollar project in the middle of nowhere. So what we really need is we need a probabilistic cost and schedule risk model that will kind of help us understand what's going on the project and get ahead of those things that potentially could be risks to the project. A recent study here in Alberta, where I'm located, said that on average, Alberta-based mega projects experienced a 19% project cost growth and a 17% project schedule growth. And that's probably not too surprising, but what is interesting is the correlation between cost and schedule. I mean, we all know that if a project takes longer to build, it's going to cost more, but studies have shown that those two numbers are actually quite closely correlated. So we have this need. We need to be able to model our schedules and costs more accurately. We need to limit our financial exposure. We also need to get reproducible results across our projects. So we need a standard methodology and an audit trail for our risk exercises. We need improved likelihood for project success, giving the project team confidence in the results. We need buy-in from our team members. We need to increase our company's maturity in conducting risk analysis. And ultimately, we want to store everything in a common database so that everything's available and we can actually work with it down the road. Now, Safran risk analysis is a great solution for this. And there's a number of reasons for that. I mentioned at the beginning that I worked with PertMaster software, which became Primavera Risk Analysis, and I've worked with that tool for just about 20 years now. And it was an amazing tool when it came out. It was still a pretty good tool in 2013, but that was the last time it was updated. So it's kind of become, you know, it hasn't moved on as technology and requirements have. So Safran's a great choice. It lets us put ranges on our estimates. It lets us look at key risk events. It lets us model our costs separately, but with the schedule. It lets us understand logic uncertainty. And basically, it gives us a good idea of what's going to happen on our project. So let's dive in. I'm going to walk you through some examples in the tool. As Shannon mentioned up front, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them into the question section and we'll get them answered at the end. I will be going through it fairly quickly, but if there's things that are of particular interest, we will have time at the end to go back to them. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so this is what Safran Risk looks like when you first log in. Now, the way the system is built, it's built on Safran Project, which is a tool equivalent to Primavera P6 in terms of its target market and capabilities. It has a number of tabs across the top of the screen. And the idea is as we open our projects, we're going to work from left to right. So there's a workflow identified here where we basically enter our data, we do our analysis, and then we look at our results. So I'm going to open up a project here. By the way, you can import projects from P6 in the form of XCRs or from Microsoft Project in the form of XML files. So I'm just going to open up a project here. This is a pretty simple project. We're going to design, build, and test an unmanned air vehicle, a UAV. So when I open it up, it takes me to the schedule section, and just like in P6, I can create filters and layouts and everything else in here. I can change the schedule if I need to change logic or I need to change constraints or anything like that. I can do that right here in the system. I don't necessarily have to go back to P6 or Microsoft Project to make my changes. And I can, as I mentioned, I can create filters. For example, if I just wanted to look at the design work, I can do so. And I can save that as a layout just like I would in P6. Now, the nice thing about this is if I do create a filter in this module, this filter will carry forward. So if I'm dealing with a really large schedule, I can create a number of filters and I can use them. And as I go through the analysis and I do my risk mappings and everything else, that filter will stay on. So it lets me work with smaller subsets of the big schedule as I go. Let's turn that back off. The system also has a tab for schedule warnings. So the schedule warnings will look for the things that typically cause problems during a risk analysis. So this is constantly updated. So whenever I fix something, it will update and it will drop off. If I create problems, new things will appear on the list. And this is always being monitored within the system. There is, in fact, over and above the standard check, which is on this particular install that I have, there's also a full DCMA 14-point schedule checker available as an extra cost item for people who need that additional level of analysis. The nice thing about this is I can just link to this activity by clicking on it. So if I want to go look at this activity, which has a lag on it, I can click on it. It will take me right to that activity. And then I can go down and I can take a look at the relationships and decide whether I need to change them or not. If I'm happy with what's in here and there's no big issues I need to deal with, I can move on. And I've now be comfortable that my schedule is ready for risk analysis. Now, for those of you who might have used Primavera risk analysis, or PRA, or OPRA as some people call it, in that tool we have different levels where we put our risks and our uncertainties. So in PRA, we have a risk register, which is used for risk events, and we have uncertainties just get put directly on the activities, or in a module called risk factors that very few people use. Now, when Safran was developing this tool, they actually worked with the people who originally developed PRA, back when the PERT master days, and they said to them, okay guys, if you started from scratch, knowing everything you know about risk analysis, what would you do differently? And one of the things that they came up with was, they said we would not separate uncertainties and risk events into different places in the software. We'd put it all together in one register. So that's what this project risks is all about. So the idea is that all the uncertainties and all the risk events on my project all get put in this one register. Now, I can have standard risks. So a standard risk is one where I can define a probability of occurrence, in this case 40% probability of occurrence, and I can define an impact, and it can be a schedule impact, it can be a cost impact, or it can be both. So I have the ability in here to define that. And again, it's all in one place. So I don't have to go somewhere else and build a resource loaded schedule and put risks on down at that level. I can do it. I can basically define all of the risks right here. The other thing that I can do is I can define a pre-mitigated position, and I can define a post-mitigated position for any particular risk. I can also record any action items that I have to get me from the pre-mitigated position to the post-mitigated position, which is really useful because I can add durations to my schedule and I can add costs to my schedule, so that when I model my mitigation strategies, the cost and time included in those strategies will be in the model. And that's very useful when you want to evaluate whether a mitigation strategy is worth pursuing or not. I can change the probability of occurrence or the impact for those post-mitigated positions as well. Now, for a particular impact, an impact can be relative impact or it can be an absolute impact. So a relative impact means that it's a percentage of the original duration or cost. If it's an absolute impact, it's going to be an impact in days or dollars. So if I switch this to an absolute impact, it would now be a 100-day impact anytime that it fires on each of the activities it's associated with. Right? If I have it as a relative impact, it's going to take whatever the duration was. If it's, say, 10 days, it's going to multiply that and say, okay, the output of this is going to be 10 days, 10 days, 16 and a half days. Now, it supports many different distribution shapes. All the standard ones are here. So if you don't like triangular distribution shapes, or if you prefer to use some other shape, you can do so. I'm using triangular shapes for the most part in this model because it's just simple to show people. Now, I mentioned that my standard risks can have a probability that I define. So the probability can be anywhere from 1 to 100%. If the probability, if I'm dealing with uncertainties, I would make the probability 100%. So in that case, it always happens, but it's going to be an uncertainty factor as opposed to a risk event. So it's going to fire every iteration. Now I have a couple of other risk types that I can define as well. I can define calendar risks. So in this case, I can make probabilistic calendars. So what's the probability that I'm not going to be able to work on a particular day, maybe because I'm allowing for bad weather conditions or high sea conditions or anything like that. I can develop these probabilistic calendars that will model lost time, and I can build those into my schedule. And then the final type I have is what we call estimate uncertainties. Now, estimate uncertainties essentially, let me click on this one, work the same as standard risk types, except that with an estimate uncertainty, I can only choose one of them. So in this case, we've defined a low, medium, and a high uncertainty. When we get to the risk mapping, you'll see that I can only choose one of them. So either this item is low uncertainty or medium uncertainty or high uncertainty. I cannot choose more than one, whereas with my standard risks, I can choose as many as I need to. All right, so once we've entered our risks into the project risks tab, the next thing that we can do in the system is we can go to the risk mapping. And the risk mapping section allows us to take those risks and associate them with the activities in the schedule. And I'm going to come back and show how they're applied to the cost worksheet a little later on. So if you're interested in the cost section, you'll see that shortly. So the first thing is that if I choose a particular activity, perhaps design the GPS system, here's where my estimate uncertainty risks come. So on the left side of the screen, I've got the choice of none, low, medium, or high. So those were my estimate uncertainties. And you can see that the shape of the selection box is a circle, so it's a radio button. So if I choose one or the other, it deselects the previous one. So I can only choose one of these for my my estimate uncertainty items. Now my standard risks, I can choose as many as I want. So in this particular case, I've selected two of them, one for the ash cloud risk and one for merger and acquisition risk. And perhaps I also want to add one in for design risk. So one of the really nice things about the way Safran works is when you associate your risks to your activities, the system does all the background work for you. So one of the challenges with Primavera risk analysis was always that when I was applying uncertainties, I could only apply one uncertainty to an individual activity in the schedule. So that was a problem because if I had multiple uncertainties, I would have to figure out myself what the impact looked like because I could only enter one. Now, what Safran does is it does that work for you. So if I go and look on the bottom of the screen, there's a tab that says risks. And for this line item, this schedule activity, these are the risks that I've associated with it. So I have got my estimate uncertainty, and then I've got my risk events. But what the system also does is it will show me the impact of those. So it's telling me, okay, you chose the ash cloud risk, which was 40% likely. You chose the merger or acquisition risk, which was 10% likely. You chose the estimate uncertainty medium, so it's an estimate uncertainty, so it's 100% likely to occur. And this is what the distribution looks like, 90 to 115%. And you chose the design risk, which was a 50% probability of occurrence. And then what it does is it takes each of these and it combines them together, applies them to the activity, does a little mini analysis, and shows you what the distribution shape is going to look like. So as I mentioned before, with all of these things that I've put on here, if I was doing it in PRA, the risk events I could put in the risk, register, and it would apply them. But my uncertainties I would have to manually enter. In this case, I just do it all here, and the system shows me what my distribution shape is going to look like. And this is really useful, particularly if you're dealing with absolute impacts, because I might have a 10-day activity and I accidentally put a 100-day absolute impact risk event on it. And so what I'll see is I'll see a very strange shape distribution that'll warn me that maybe something's wrong and I need to reconsider that application. So again, I can just go through and look at my different activities and see what each distribution shape is going to look like. So again, it's a really useful preview. It also shows me what the deterministic value was as that black bar and what the mean value is with the gray bar. So I can kind of get an idea how far apart my deterministic value and my mean value are in my distribution, which is also very useful. Okay, so now that I've actually applied my risks to my activities, now what I can do is I can actually go and run the analysis. I may want to include correlation in my model. And if you do want to include correlation, it's available. They've done a really nice, the way they've set it up is really nice because what you can do here, and let's just turn it off, is I can choose to correlate any of my risks together. So rather than do this at the activity level in the schedule, I correlate risks together. And I can correlate the likelihood of the risk occurring as well as the schedule impact and or the cost impact just by defining this correlation. So if you do have correlation between your risks, it's very easy to map this and to create this mapping, as opposed to going through and trying to link individual activities together. All right, so let's move on to the analysis. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to step through an analysis. But before I do that, I want to talk about some of the features here that I think are really great. The first one is that I can choose a pre-mitigated or post-mitigated position for any of my risks. So rather than do all pre-mitigated or all post-mitigated, what I can do is I can say, okay, let me run with the post-mitigated position on a couple of these risks. And this is really useful when you're, again, evaluating your mitigation strategies and trying to figure out which ones you're going to do or not do, because I can just toggle between them. So I could say, okay, these 3 risks here, I'm going to run in a post-mitigated position. The rest I'm going to run in a pre-mitigated position. So rather than the all or nothing, I can mix and match as required. Now I can also turn risks off by clearing the checkbox. So if I want to run the model without a particular risk, I can just clear the checkbox and then it'll run without that risk included. So sometimes you have a risk that has a huge impact and you want to see what it looks like without that particular impact. You can do so just by turning it off and rerunning the analysis. I'm just going to flip everything back to my pre-mitigated position here before we go any further. And I'll turn them all on. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about focus activities. So a lot of times when we're dealing with a schedule risk analysis or a cost risk analysis, I don't really care about the overall model. So for example, if we talk about a schedule, what I really care about is when I'm turning this facility over to the owner. Sometimes we call that transfer of care, custody, and control, or TCCC. Sometimes it's just called handover, whatever it happens to be. That's usually the thing I care about. And typically a schedule will have a whole bunch of stuff behind that, like demobilization, contract closeouts, release of holdbacks, all that kind of stuff. And I don't really necessarily want to have that in my model, because it's not the key data I'm concerned with. So what I can do is, instead of actually going and running against the whole model, I can choose a focus act. I can choose one or more focus activities. So maybe I want to choose agree the contract, and I want to include one here for finalize design, and maybe I want to choose one down here for the start of testing. So I can just choose any of these intermediate points that I'm interested in. I'll turn that one on. And then the idea is that then I can get back to these very quickly. So I can always move around and choose any activity that I want when I run the analysis. But if I've got those key milestones or those key deliverables, I can define those and I can monitor those as I go through the analysis. All right, so let's run the analysis. So I'm going to click Run Analysis. I have Step Through turned on. And by the way, you can use Monte Carlo analysis, which is what it runs by default, or you can run Latin hypercube analysis. You can choose to include or exclude correlations, and you can choose to resource level after each iteration if you're dealing with a resource leveled schedule. I'm going to click Run the Analysis, and it takes me to the Gantt chart, and I can just step through just like I would in Primavera risk analysis, and I can just make sure that things are moving the way I expect. You know, sometimes you'll have a constraint or some bad logic in there that'll mean that when you're actually stepping through, you'll see something not moving, and this gives you a chance to go back and understand why. When I get tired of clicking through and watching it move, I can hit complete, and it runs very quickly, by the way. So one of the nicest features is it's very fast. And it takes me to the distribution graph, which is pretty much standard in any risk analysis tool. Now, the distribution graph shows me how many times a particular date or cost comes up, and it also tells me where my deterministic value was. So in this example here, it's telling us that the probability of achieving our deterministic finish date of September 26th is about 2%, which is pretty low. It's telling me that if I want to get to a P70 value or P70 confidence level, I'm going to need to add about 5 months to my, or 4.5 months to my schedule, because I'm going to go from the the 26th of September to the 2nd of February. Okay, so this is fairly standard, but I can go through at any point if I want to choose a particular activity and understand where that activity is being driven. I can also look at that particular activity, or as I mentioned before, I can set up my focus activities and I can look specifically at those focus activities. So again, if you have a large schedule with some key milestones, you can make them the focus activities, and you could look at those rather than scrolling through the schedule all the time trying to find that particular milestone. So we've got our distribution, and we can see what that looks like. Perhaps we want to see what's driving that. Now, in Safran, because everything comes from the project risks module, we can also track all of our tornado graphs back to the risk. So what I can see here is these are the risks driving the finish date of the project. So the ash cloud is the biggest driver. It's got a correlation of 63%. And then I've got testing overrun, e-communication, and procurement delays. So it's giving me my correlation value, 63%, 49%, 42%, 24%. And that's great. The relative impact is important. The project team, though, typically doesn't really care about what your Pearson's product moment correlation percent is. What they care about is how many days impact is that having on my schedule. So I'm going to talk about that in just a second. But before I do that, I also want to point out that it also will tell you which activities are driving the project. And again, I can choose any particular point in here. If I want to look at what's driving that particular point, I can choose, say, finalize design, and it immediately tells me what are the drivers against that. So I can choose any intermediate point, and of course, again, I've got my focus activities, so I can choose my focus activities and understand what's driving my focus activities rather than the entire schedule. Okay, so I mentioned before, a lot of times people don't really understand or care about the correlation percent that comes out of the system. To them, that's just a statistic. So the question they always ask is, what's the real world impact of that particular risk? So 63%, fine, but what does it mean to my schedule? Well, they've got a great option here called sensitivity analysis. And what sensitivity analysis allows you to do is it allows you to choose a confidence level. I've chosen P70. And again, I can choose the overall project, or I can choose one of my focus activities. Right now, well, let's run it on the entire project. And what I can do when I run this is it will actually turn off each risk in turn and then turn it back on again. And run the analysis each time in between. Now, this is called analysis by exclusion. And in PRA, I had a number of clients over the years who would run this manually. They'd turn the risk off, run the model, record the results in Excel, turn the risk back on, turn the next risk off, run the model, and they would just keep going through this process and putting everything manually into Excel. What Safran does is it allows you to do that all automatically. So what it's telling me is that when it actually runs through, it finds that these are the real world impacts of my risks. So I can say that testing overrun actually turned out to be a bigger number than the ash cloud. Even though the ash cloud was the highest one on my tornado chart, the actual scheduled impact of testing overrun was slightly higher at 37 days. The impact of the ash cloud was 35 days. The poor flying conditions was 29 days, etc. So I can tell the project team, look, this is what these things really look like. And by the way, down the bottom here, you see that we've actually got an opportunity there. We have an outsource opportunity, which actually is saving us 4 days on the schedule. So I can look at that on a tornado basis, or I could look at it on an S-curve basis. Now, it's a bit noisy when everything's turned on, so let's just look at what this means as I actually turn them on. So I'm going to start off with all the risks turned on. So that's the none. In other words, no risks are turned off. And then I'm going to go and turn off testing overrun. So there's the savings that I get from testing overrun. Okay, now I'll turn on the next one. There's the savings from ash cloud. Now remember, these are being considered individually. So you can see there at P70, the savings is pretty much the same. It's 37 days or 35 days between the two of them. They're pretty close. If I turn on my little outsource opportunity down here, you can see that things get worse if I turn that off. So it pushes my curve to the right when I don't look at that particular one. So the next question the project team will ask is, okay, that's fine. What's the cumulative saving if I turn those off? Am I going to get 37 plus 35 days if I turn off those first two? Well, the system will answer that for you as well, because what we can do is we can go under the options section and we can ask it to do multiple passes based on our schedule, and we can tell it the number of risks we want to look at. So let's just look at the top 5, and I'll just close the options screen and I'll rerun the analysis. So now what it's going to do is it's going to run them, and after it turns the top one off, it'll turn off the next top one, then the next top one, then the next top one. So again, it's saying, in fact, if I do turn these off, I had 37 and 35 days. It's saying you're not quite going to save that much, but you'll save 37 and 29 days, right? So it's still worth doing. So here's the cumulative saving as I turn off each of these top risks. So this should help motivate the project team to actually look at those risks and see what we can do about them. All right, so I mentioned before the idea of doing integrated cost and schedule modeling. So many years ago, I was lead scheduler on a project for Shell, and Shell required us to do a schedule risk analysis every quarter on this project. It was a relatively small project for Shell. It was a couple $2 billion, but they still had requirements, and that one of them was that we do a cost and schedule risk analysis every quarter. So I would do the schedule one, and my coworker, who was the cost lead, would do his, and we never really talked about it. We just did 2 completely separate analyses. And then we send it up to corporate, and 2 different people would look at them and they would approve them or ask questions or whatever. After a while, the 2 of us said, well, we should really discuss this. So I would start giving him the results of my model, which he would build into his model so we could get a more accurate cost out. However, that's still not an ideal approach. What we really need to do is we really need to be able to build an integrated model so that as the schedule changes, we can see the impacts on the cost model immediately. Well, people tried to do that by building resource-loaded schedules, and I've done that myself a few times in Primavera risk analysis. The problem with that is it's a lot of work, because basically you are trying to put in all of your costs, including some that are not schedule related, into a schedule, just so the ones that are schedule related can be built into the model. So you end up with this sort of, well, I guess forcing the square peg into the round hole. It can be done, but it's a lot of work. And every time the costs change, you've got to go back and rework that whole model. Every time the schedule changes, you've got to go back and rework the model. So it's a lot of work. It's possible, it has been done, but man, it's hard. So what Safran's decided to do, and before I say that, before I move on, the other thing was that there have been a number of people who have published papers over the last few years about how important it is to do integrated cost and schedule analysis. And if you go to Safran's site, there's a number of papers there that you can look at and download, a number of white papers that talk about how important it is. And AACE has pretty much said that they consider it to be a best practice that you do an integrated cost and schedule analysis, cost and schedule risk analysis. It's actually quite interesting, the benefits that people get from that. So again, I'd highly suggest you go and download those white papers from Safran's website. Most of them are written by Dr. David Hewlett, who's considered a real thought leader in this field. So remember what I said. We tried to combine our cost and schedule, first of all, just by feeding the schedule results into the cost model, and then we tried again by building resource-loaded schedules. Neither one worked particularly well, and what we really needed to do was to build a separate cost risk model that we could link to the schedule model. And so that's what Safran has done. So I'm going to go to the cost tab, and the idea in the cost section, oh, let me just go back on that. For some reason, it's giving me a warning message here. Okay, so I can build my cost model here, and I can put all of my cost line items in. I can put my base cost. I can put in an uncertainty, a base uncertainty on there if I want to. I can also put calculations in here. So if I have uncertainty around units or hours or something, I can build a formula in here as well. So in this case, my project manager time is a formula where I've got the duration of a particular activity multiplied by a cost, which has an uncertainty on it. So I can do that as well. I can build formulas in there with uncertainties on them. Let me just turn off columns here for a second. There we go. Okay, so I can put all of my cost items in there, and I can put a base uncertainty on each one. So if I'm doing a plus minus 10% estimate or 15% estimate, I can build that uncertainty in here. But here's where it gets interesting, because I can link all of these cost line items to the risks that I defined in my project risk section. So if I go to the risks part, I can open this up and I can choose any of, or all, if I want to, of the risks I defined in project risks that had cost uncertainties associated with them. So as long as it's in the project risk section and it has a cost uncertainty, it's available here for me to choose. So what I can do is I can turn on as few or as many of my risks as I want to. So that's really useful, because now what I can do is I've got the same risks being applied to both the schedule and to the cost model, and they're going to have the same probability of occurrence. And so when they fire, they're going to fire in both places, and they're going to have an impact. But I mentioned earlier that what I really wanted to do was I wanted to choose to link some of these items to my schedule. And I can do that by turning on the schedule section of the columns. And the idea here is that I can link all or a portion of a line item in my cost worksheet to an activity in my schedule. So if I look at this testing resources, it's a $310,000 activity. What I've said is half of those dollars are related to the duration of this particular activity. Now, I can choose any percentage I want between 1 and 100%. So I may decide that, you know what, only a portion, in this case 50% of that cost, is being associated with the duration of the activity. If I want to, I could also choose multiple activities and put a different percentage on each. So in this case, with the next activity down, I've said, okay, this line item is related 50% to this scheduled task and 10% to this scheduled task. Now, what the system does is it will take that assignment that you've made. It'll say, okay, if we go back to the previous one, the 310,000, you told me that 50% of that cost is associated with the duration of the activity. So it will calculate, okay, there is $155,000 of the $310,000 that is a variable, and it will look at the activity, the deterministic duration of the activity, and it will calculate a day rate. And then what happens is, as the duration of the activity changes, as we run each iteration of the model, that cost will change as well. Now, the way it works is any uncertainties or risks that I've assigned to my cost line item will be built into that calculation. So whatever the current iteration cost of that item is, that's what will be associated with the activity. And so the calculation will be very dynamic, because the base cost is changing, the duration of the activity is changing, and it's doing all of that in each iteration of the cost model. So the idea here is that I can define only those cost items which are schedule related. So I'm getting around that idea of having to build a cost loaded schedule with a whole bunch of stuff that is not schedule related, but I have the flexibility of linking as I need to. So let's take a look at what happens when I actually run this. So what I'm going to do here is, because I'm on a small screen so everybody can see what I'm doing, I'm going to turn off the schedule section again. Usually run it in my office. I run on a big monitor, but it's very difficult to see on a presentation. Well, I'm going to add in another column here at the end, which is my iteration value, just so we can see what happens. So when I actually go back to the Analyze tab, I'm going to step through again, but this time I'm going to step through the cost model. So when I run the analysis, it takes me to the Gantt chart, but what I can do is I can just move to the cost module, and then what I can do is I can step through in the cost model, and I can see what my values are for each iteration. Now, it also lights up the risks that are firing in this iteration. So as I step through, I can see in some cases the risks are all off, in other cases some are on, in some cases all are on, and I can just see on the iteration value where my cost is going. So in this case, I can see exactly where I end up on each iteration as I step through. And again, when I get tired of clicking through, I can hit complete. So it takes me to the distribution graph, but this time I want to look at it instead of a schedule basis, I want to look at it on a cost basis. So remember that I think my probability of achieving my schedule end date, well, let's take a quick look here, was 2%. The probability of achieving my cost value is around 29%. So in the model, I've got a better chance of achieving the costs than I do the schedule, but neither one of them is particularly great. And it's telling me to get up to a P70 value, I need to add probably about $400,000 of contingency. Now, just like I did with the schedule, I can look at the drivers, again on a cost basis, and it will tell me these are the things that are driving your cost model. So I see a tornado around the costs. Similarly, I can look at a sensitivity analysis, again around the costs. And actually, let me just flip I'm going to do another multiple pass, but this time I'm going to do it based on cost as my key metric. So this way, again, I can see what I'm going to save by looking at the top 5 cost drivers. So in this case, the first one that came up was that design risk, and it says if I can remove that, I can save about $145,000 out of my budget. Again, at a P70 confidence level. So I have this ability then to look at it and say, okay, so now I can kind of see which things are driving my cost model. I can see which things are driving my schedule model. I've got the interdependencies all mapped. Okay, so that's great. You know, I needed about $400,000 or about 4 months of time to get my two values into the P70 range. But that's not all that people are asking for, because a project isn't successful or isn't considered successful if it's on time or over budget. It's also not considered successful if it's on budget but over time. What we really want to do is we really want to understand what's the probability of being on time and on budget. Now, because we have everything in one model, we can look at our scatter plot to answer that question. Now, what the system is telling me here is it's divided up into 4 quadrants. So the lower left quadrant is the probability of me achieving both cost and schedule goals, right? So this is my budget, my deterministic budget. This is my deterministic schedule. So the probability of achieving both is only about 2%. Now the probability of achieving my cost goals is shown up as being quadrants 1 and 2. So all of these hits here represent where I was on budget. The problem is that I was way over schedule in some of these examples, so that would not be considered a successful project. The third quadrant, the upper right quadrant, is showing me all of the hits, so each of these dots represents a hit when in my 1,000 iterations. All the ones in this upper right, quadrant are the ones where I didn't achieve cost or schedule. Okay, so I want to achieve both. I achieved neither in this quadrant. And then the fourth quadrant, the upper left quadrant, is the ones where I achieved that schedule target that I had, but did not achieve my cost goals. So I have a P70 schedule value. So that said that if I can push the schedule out to the beginning of February, which would be out here somewhere, I can get to a P70 confidence level on my schedule. And if I push my costs up to about, I think it was about $8.5 million, I can get a P70 confidence level on my cost. But what does that get me overall? Well, what we can do is we can put those in as our targets. So I'm going to put in here the beginning of February the 5th, okay, which moves me out to my my P70 value here in terms of my schedule. And on my cost, I can go to my $8.5 million. Which puts me at my P70 cost. But what the system's saying is, well, that's all good. You're doing better, like but you're still only at 51% joint confidence level. So what we need to do is we need to capture, if we want a P70 joint confidence level, we need to capture 70% of these dots. Now, we can do that by adding more time, or we can do that by adding more cost. So we can move this target to capture more of the dots to give us that P70 confidence level. Now, I wanted a JCL of 70%, and because my highlighter is set at 70%, the system shows me the division between the 50% highlighter and the 70% highlighter goes from orange to red. So what I really want to do is I want to be right on that interface between those 2 points. So if I hover my cursor on this orange dot, it says, okay, that's a 70% confidence level at $8.7 million and March the 3rd. There's another one here, which is February the 29th for $8.75 million. And the important thing here is that to get a joint confidence level of 70%, it's not actually a single point, it's a continuum of points. And a lot of people call that the JCL necklace because it kind of looks like a pearl necklace. And what's important about that is the project team can decide whether they want to spend some money to save some time or give up some time to save some money, depending on the goals of the project. So they can achieve P70 anywhere from up here at this dot here where we're spending $9.2 million, but we're finishing at the beginning of February, all the way down here to where we're spending only $8.6 million, but we're finishing out in June. So somewhere along that curve, that line of dots are the options that the project team has to work with. So you can decide where you want to be on that curve. As I said before, it's more of a continuum as opposed to a single point value. What we need to do is just capture 70% of the hits on the scatter plot. Right? So if I was to say, okay, let's look at this point here. If I was to say, okay, we're going to put our budget up to $8.7 million and we're going to aim for March the 3rd. So we'll change this to 8.7. Set this to give ourselves some more time. So we're going to go to March the 3rd. Okay, the system comes up and says, okay, now you're at 69, effectively you're at 70%. But again, the project team could say, well, if we spend a bit more money, we could bring the time back a little bit. Or if we're already over budget, well, we could save a bit of money if we can live with pushing the schedule back a bit. So again, that's the decision that the project team needs to make. So one more thing I want to talk about before we open it up for questions is that we've got the probabilistic cash flow. So now, because we've linked our cost and our schedule together, we can generate a probabilistic cash flow. So again, the idea here is that I can look at what's going on in my costs. I can link it to the schedule, and I don't necessarily have to link every cost to a schedule line item. What I can do is I can also manually input some costs or some dates for costs if I need to. But based on that, I can generate a probabilistic cash flow that shows us when we're going to spend the money on this particular project. And quite often that's very important because when you're dealing with a project that's being funded from operational money, they need to know what the spend each period is going to be. It's also very useful if you're dealing with multi-year projects or multi-budgetary year projects, and you want to capture as much of that budget in a year as possible. And this is going to show you what you're going to spend each year. So again, because we've got everything in one place, we can generate this as well. Okay, so that's a very quick, high-level view of all the things that Safran can do. If anyone would like to ask any questions, please feel free to type them into the questions box, and we'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Okay, so we're not getting any questions. So either I did a really good job of explaining it, or it went so quickly that people are still thinking about what we talked about. So if you do have any questions and you think of them after we're done, please feel free to reach out to us. Our contact information is here. If you have any questions that you'd like to have answered, please feel free to reach out to me. My email is on the screen, as well as my direct phone number. You can also find information about Safran at our website, which is emerald-associates.com, or you can go to safran.com and you can take a look at the information on their website, and they do have a very good learning path with a number of white papers about risk analysis in general, integrated cost and schedule risk analysis, and also some posts by various people about why you should upgrade and all that sort of thing. So all of that stuff is available on their website. Again, please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. We do run training for this software. So we have a training class available if you are coming from Primavera Risk Analysis, or if you're coming from some other tool to Safran. We can talk about what's different between the tools, and or we can do a training right from scratch for people who've never used risk analysis tools before. All right, so thanks very much for joining us. Have a good day, and stay safe out there.